Your audio. Test, test, test. Looks to be going. Cool. Right till everybody pops in here. Before I start letting people in. I guess I got a couple people waiting. That's only 2 minutes. Slow pop. Yeah, slow pop everybody in. Wait for it. Boom. There we go. Cool, cool, cool. Welcome to Evidence. I'm gonna move this over just a hair. No, it takes me out of the screen. Boop. Will do. Boop. Maybe that can still be readable. I don't know. We'll play with it a little bit, see how much I move around. I'm gonna get some water first. I'll be right back. We got about 2 minutes left, maybe one. Right back. Now, officially 1 o'clock. Welcome to class. All right. So last time, I believe we left off talking about dogs. Let's see here. If we make it all the way through it. Patriot Act. So we're talking about Patriot Act, this kind of stuff. And then when we finish this up, we're going to go and finish the Miranda stuff because there's a little bit more in Miranda about. We skipped over, I think it was chapter 13. We'll go back and hit. My last class, I was running stuff from the computer, so I had to kind of change things up a little bit. Ooh, too much. Nope, wrong way. Everything's in reverse on the screen that I see. Now you can see what PowerPoint I have up, so I don't have to necessarily share the screen because you guys have all that stuff. Kind of get into some discussion stuff, especially when we get to Miranda, because that'll be a little bit of fun. I'll look back and see what they were talking about there. And it's like, I know exactly the subject matter we're getting to there. I think the black one was showing up pretty well. Yeah, good. Okay. So last time we were talking about the Patriot Act and how it had massively changed basically governmental structure at the federal level. Also, in terms of daily lives, the number of ways in which you can reach into it, kind of thing. I'll tell you a story. How about that? We'll start with a story. So I don't always tell the story. So back in 2001, I was still in high school, so I wasn't involved in this actual story. Yeah, I'm walking around. So one of the people I used to work for many years ago was working for the FBI at the time, counterintelligence, and that was whenever the planes went hit the buildings, right? And so you can imagine the I don't want to say chaos, it wasn't like full on chaos everywhere at that specific location. It was for Twin Towers and everything else that happened that day. But he got called up and I had to go find someone who was in the state we were in at that time. And basically what it was a known associate of the people who commandeered, took over those airplanes, right, by force, terrorists. And so this is a person who's a known associate of terrorists that was local and had disappeared. And so huge amount of concern related to public safety, right? Because if you just had what would have been what, less than a dozen people cause how many deaths? No, maybe it's more than a dozen. I have to go back and count. But that kind of number and the number of people responsible for being exceedingly few, you can see how those scales move, right? What are we talking about? How important an issue is it? Life and death, okay? And then that scale, how many people? So you see those scales moving in that moment. You have all the privacy concerns, all of the individual freedoms that person would have being here in this country, right? And so with that type of thing going on, how are you going to find that person, right? There's expedience there. Where are there any lines that you would cross? Where are those lines at, right? For government, it's not really that hard. It's just asking, for the most part. It's one of the more interesting things when it comes to how connected the world is today. It's really one of the kind of things that's really interesting if you really dig into like the data side of things, you like numbers or money, because it's all the same kind of thing you're doing with numbers. In that case, it's credit card companies, right? Okay, tell me where this person's active at. Well, that's private information. Okay, well, let me tell you about this guy. He is a friend to how long do you think it was before that company turned over that information, right? At that point in time, they've been notified of it. Who's going to be responsible if they hold that information back, and what is it they're protecting versus what is the cost, right? So companies do the business, the map on that business side too, right? What ended up happening in that case was that person's rights were technically violated, though that person would never know that their privacy was violated in that way. Why is that? Most of the time, that digital stuff, there's no evidence, and that's why this stuff is as dangerous as it is. Particularly when there's outside entities involved that have some stake in the game, those are your corporations. It adds in another level of complexity. That's what I was telling you about, like the FISA courts, whenever they would have those, every now and again they have a special master who goes through and reviews those. Hey, I'd love to have you actually here in person. You get an A. Actually, my kid. Start telling a story about 9/11. So I don't know if I told you this one before. So back in 2001, of course, I was a high school student, so I'm not directly involved in any of this stuff. But one of the bosses I worked for over the years, he was in counterintelligence at the time, so he got called back out. And basically, his job was he was given the name of the person he needed to find because he was directly tied to the terrorists who commandeered the planes. And so it's like, oh shit, that just happened like a couple hours ago, and I have no time to find this guy. And so you think about the gravity of that type of situation, the authorities that you have as a governmental official, and the need to know, right, where that person's at and what they're up to. And in that state, that instance, it's like you have no idea what that person can go to. In a rural area alone, it's like just think of the abilities to well, hell, it's like we live in a rural area. Think of all the abilities to get in trouble there are out here. It's a lot more than in a big city because you got so much more space. And yeah, so basically what ended up happening is start with credit card companies. That actually goes pretty quick. As credit card was last place was active at and track you down from there. That is privileged information though. That usually requires some type of court order to get, but because of time constraints and the nature of it, skipped all that. Just dealt with the person as a person. Talking to you at this corporation. I am who I am. Where was this person last at? Can you tell me? They were at. No warrant, no court order, no official process is done on the informal side because of the nature of what's there. Realize that that's something that can run with this, right? Anytime you have any type of system, anything like this, it's like you have all the good and all the ill that come with it, and there's a lot of danger there, a lot of danger. So that person's rights, privacy, technically violated. The gravity there being what it was, it's justifiable, but at the same time, that person never knew, right? Never knew how he was identified. Just knows all of a sudden there are people showing up at his door, kind of thing. Like, yeah, that's the kind of thing that we're talking about here. All right, those powers are pretty expansive. Last time I think I mentioned Stellar Wind. That's one of the higher profile ones because the nature of it. They bulked out a collection on communications for all American citizens. Ooh, massive privacy violation, massive. Yeah, so if you think about that, you think about how much information there is available about any one person, anyone, how easy it is to identify them, to the kind of havoc you can wreak pretty quickly. Okay. Let's see. So here's some of the stuff that walk and talk means to avoid disrupt electronic surveillance, right? So some of those powers when we talk about surveillance, things like roving wiretaps, that's getting a cell phone is really easy, like 15, 20 bucks. How if you get one of the cheap flip ones, you can get them cheaper than that. And so how easy is it I've got a phone I'm using for drug deals, I've used it for a couple weeks, and then toss to get a different, right? Normally those processes would be you have to go back to the court, get new authorization, new phone number. Well, that's going to take some time. In that time, you're going to be missing conversation. You're going to be missing conversation. And that might be vital information. It might be, well, just think about like those drug trafficking, right? You have a couple days where you're not tracking them, how much stuff can take place? Okay, a big drop happened at this point in time. Maybe some details changed, and now everything you were setting up is wrong. And so it's very important to stay up on those things. At the same time, you're tracking something else. It's like you've moved because they did. But that's the nature of the game. Let's see. Walk and talk, use of public and private phones, so mixing those things. And that's where you get into the surveillance stuff related to the Patriot Act, roving wiretaps, and that kind of stuff. Overheard conversations. We've already talked about that. Basically, move right into plain hearing. This one I'm thinking of this. Mechanical, may not use mechanical or electronic just listening devices to intrude, but if it's plain hearing, wherever you have a right to be, anything you hear, you can use. I don't know if they'll bring up the court citation, case citation for that one on the next slide. No, but it's the same kind of situation. This is one example. I have another one for confession where it's husband and wife in an interrogation. They brought the wife in to confront the husband in front of a police officer, and she said, "How could you?" And he starts explaining. So it's like that one time you got a confession. So it's like you just said that right in front of an officer. Why would you not think that that's admissible? Right? Same thing here is what I mean. Defendant making incriminating statements in favor of paid government informant. Informants are the same thing as government officials. Basically treat them as if they're government officials. If you're paying them especially, but just in general, if you're sending them off with directions to go get information, they are your agent. It's like that's what that is. That's doesn't come up so much in this class, but like when you start getting into corrections, jails, and that kind of stuff, where you get the informants there, like that's a big part of it is how they navigate those conversations. So long as you aren't the one introducing it or guiding the conversation, it's just volunteered information. You can use that. But if you're the one going in there and trying to pull out that information, that's an interrogation. They've invoked their rights. None of that's usable. You've just violated their rights. And so that's how that works. Confirmed that the conviction, no violation of the Sixth Amendment, confer private attorneys out of the presence. Yeah. So what person was there talking with their lawyer in front of someone else? And it's like, yeah, if you're right in front of them, that's not. Okay. Secret taping about conversations. This is where we talk about the single party versus two party consent states. Single party, so long as one person's aware of it in the conversation, it's okay to record. Some states require both parties. That would be, is that California, I want to say? Yeah. See, over a dozen states require that if a prior court order has not been obtained, all parties to a conversation must know about it. So that's that single party versus both party consent. Oops, too fast. Let's see, it's been bribe face-to-face tax agent. They're being recorded. Not require authorization. Recording is admissible. Does not protect the privacy of the individual in the defendant's position. Yeah. Here's where they talk about jails, vehicles, and that kind of stuff. Privacy. Yeah, you don't have it there. Yeah, there's a few different directions I could take that conversation. Be like the processing of people into these types of things. It's like, yeah, by the time you've been here, you should know that you've had hands all over you. Surreptitious recordings may be admissible during amount of interrogation. We'll talk about Miranda a little bit. Phone charges. Yeah, we'll talk about Miranda. That's a Miranda thing more than anything else. Give any specific assurances that the conversation is private. Yeah, don't tell them the conversation is private. Deceit is one of those things that it's better to leave it unsaid than to say it and lie. Right. So that's that middle ground that sometimes they'll use. All right, so this is where they move into. One of the parties may consent to the call. Most states follow this rule. Few states require court order for this procedure. Confrontational telephone call. So this is an interesting thing. It doesn't happen too often, but this would be where a suspect, but makes you talking like an informant, makes a phone call, hands the phone over to police officers, right? It could also happen like if you got arrested, they got your phone and they make a call on your phone at them, kind of thing. Here, I think they mentioned it related to drug dealers, like that thing as a way to, way to confront people, right? If you're doing that, make sure you're doing that before charging, because if you've done that, then you're moving back into Miranda. But we'll talk about that here in a minute because we're almost done with this one. All right. These were incriminating statements. Yeah. Yeah, if you're engaging in criminal activity, that's one of the quick ways they can say that, yeah, you don't have a right for that. Okay. Wires and those types of things. Everyone knows what those are. I don't know why they have a slide on that so much, really. I mean, I get that you have to, same kind of laws that govern it. Okay. Federal narcotics agents allowed to testify with conversation either overheard by means of radio transmitter, wandering undercover. So at that point in time, it's like, are you a party to that conversation? You're listening into that conversation. Is that hearsay or is that evidence? Right? Supreme Court said no good reason of public policy that deprives government from using those statements. Right? You're recording it. If you're not recording, it's still be the same thing as you listening to it. Right? You're going to bring in evidence, that kind of thing. This one, it's yeah. If there were a violation there, something of that nature, yeah, but no, not with this. Informant cannot locate. Here's another situation. This is where you start to run into. Sometimes they'll use. How do I put this? Not testimony. Instead of evidence, instead of testimony from the person who gave it, that's the best evidence rule kind of thing. That person's unavailable. Sometimes they'll allow in special exceptions. That would split this one is. You have to use the officer's testimony rather than the persons themselves. Usually that only happens in like dying declaration and things like that. We talked about that already, though. Family members. It's unlawful for any person to intercept any wire or electronic communication, except otherwise we're specifically committed. So you should not be recording people, I guess. Okay. So here's where they move into tips. This is, I'm surprised I didn't actually talk about this earlier. So as I've mentioned before, the standards here is you need to be able to corroborate the information related to a tip. The informant, it mentions here, it's like, well, the informant is a concerned citizen. Basically, what that's kind of key into is they used to do an appraisal of the informant themselves. It was called the Wheeler-Spinelli rule, two-pronged test. You have to basically verify both the informant and the information themselves. However, you can't do that with anonymous tips, right? And so if you have an informant, yeah, you can look at the background. What the hell do you do with anonymous tips if you can't test the background? What happens if it's vital information that you need to be able to act on, right? Well, Terry stop, right? That initial stop just to dispel suspicions, that's your avenue. That's how you would do that. By doing so, you can start to corroborate some of that information. Excellent, right? Sometimes they'll do that. Sometimes what they'll do is actually hold back and they'll start an investigation kind of thing. So they'll be able to corroborate it even more programs. Some of the examples after that would led to drug trafficking, though. All right. So here's where they start talking about the informant, penal interest. So you start talking about conflicts of interest there. That's the most common one we start learning, especially jailhouse and prison informants. They have to acknowledge the fact whether or not they're seeking any specific benefit, and sometimes they do. Okay. Okay, so here's what I start talking about how to do it in that indica of reliability. Time is an element. That's what this one's keying into. Right here, it's like anonymous 911 call. Minutes earlier, car ran person off the road. They stopped the car with matched description, found illegal drugs. With that description, that was close enough to be able to corroborate it, and little time for fabrication between the incident and the call. So there's little time for settlement data. That's one of the facets of it. But the more things you can corroborate about it, better it is. I guess I will use that drug trafficking example. The case that really deals with this, should remember about one I don't. Basically, it was drug trafficking. I think it was like from Chicago to Florida and back. And so they were able to corroborate the person who was leaving, when they were leaving, where they were going to, what type of vehicle they were picking up, where they would be driving back, what they would have in the vehicle that was illegal. Now, if you corroborate all those other things, it's like, all right, let's go see if that thing is illegal. We've got probable cause now. And so that's how you do that. You have to start weighing in all the factors. Time is one of them. How many things you can corroborate, much better. The more things you get, it's always additive. So the more you get, the better you are. Okay. Bomb and drug dogs, generally reliable. I want to say, probably in the last slides of this one, yeah, moving the dogs now. So last time I think I talked a little bit about dogs. Realize that you're dealing with something that's trained. It's an animal. There are certifications for such. Next slide. There are certifications for such. Those are generally the best ways to establish the dog is reliable, because that's something you can bring into question. But also, it's not necessarily the same thing as rendering it unusable. Right. Even if the dog didn't pass certification or hadn't been recently certified or whatever it is that they do for that process. Even if it hasn't happened recently, it doesn't necessarily invalidate the dog's hit on. So it's something that's still potentially rehabilitating, but it'll talk about that here in a second. First thing it's going to mention is the dog sniff is not a search. It's essentially the same thing as a police officer standing with the vehicle from a legal place, right? I'm going to stand at your vehicle again. Yeah, there's nothing in there. Dog's nose is just more accurate, more sensitive. Yeah, and so they can pick up on that stuff. Like, I mean, you can train dogs to sniff everything: drugs, bombs, cancer, right? Yeah. Like I literally saw one where they were dealing with cell samples and cancer, and the dogs could get it. It's one of those things. It's incredible, but also realize it's an animal that's trained. So we can train that animal to sit on more informal commands if you wanted to. It's like just, the dog's wanting to be a good dog. It's wanting to follow your directions. How hard would it be to get the dog to, whether it's sit down or whatever, to give an indication? Wouldn't be that hard. And so that's a question. It's always present, but you bet it. What they bet it is. You have no possessory interest in that stuff. So if you're found with it, they get you. It's like, that's how that one goes. The next element that I talk about here is time. The big thing with the dog is that if in deploying it, it needs to not cause any undue delay. And so that's what it's talking about here, that less than 10 minutes. That's definitely not an undue delay. When you get outside of that, though, that's when it can be. You have to be able to establish that, though. I'm trying to think of the upper limits for that. I don't know if you really establish a straight upper limit because there's going to be so many facets involved in that specific situation. Longest one I'd seen that said it was still good. I wasn't a dog one, it was a standard search or stop. And it was like more than half an hour. I don't think it was an hour, but there were two vehicles involved. So there was a secondary chase. And so it's like, there's a reason why. And so if you've got that justification in there, that's something that may be enough to justify it, or it may not. You'd have to wait to see what the court says if you're getting into specifics. Okay. Factors affecting reliability: training, training, success rate, and method they use to alert. If they do it in the proper manner, there's a certification step, and whether it's continuing certification requirements. So that's the report will continue, because they'll have that initial one, and there's a I don't actually know if I've ever read the time, because there's a time limit for it. I don't have that one in my mind at all, though. So after a certain period of time, they have to go back in and get recertified to make sure they're still valid. So like human equivalent, qualifying with your firearms every couple of years kind of thing. Not all the time, but enough to maintain that, yes, you are keeping up with it. Sometimes that falls by the wayside. So every now and then, I think there's a couple of cases I've seen where it dealt with that. So it's not necessarily something that invalidates the dog. Cool, that's that chapter. So we need to go back to, I have 13 in here, 14, a deal. Because that was the one on, no, it was 12. That's what it was. Get on that one. Yeah, skip 12. Let's get 12 now. This is evidence and 12. So this one's about Miranda. Is a little out of order, which is why since we moved off into exclusionary rule stuff, I kind of skipped on this one because it's important for the exclusionary rule stuff to some degree. It's more Miranda than it is anything else. And next time I teach this class, I'll probably flip these two sections, do the exclusionary rule first, and then move into Miranda. It flows better that way. Miranda, probably the biggest question that is when. Okay, so we'll start out with other questions. Pardon me. What is it we say when we Miranda someone? You have the right to remain silent.
Anything you say can and will be used against you. You have the right to return. You can afford one. One will be explained to you. You understand these rights that have been given to you.
And do you wish to continue speaking? Yeah, perfect. And so when you break that down, what you end up with is, of course, your Fifth Amendment, your Sixth Amendment, silence and lawyer, the counsel. It also ties in the indigency clause. That's if you can't afford a lawyer. And so that's the important facet of it. And then that last part, those last two lines, those are your waivers. Do you understand? And you still want to continue talking. So that's what it is. Why we've talked about already, because without it, there's no limit to this thing. You can keep people talking forever and get them to confess all kinds of things. But when do we have to give it? So when is it given?
When you start questioning a person.
Questions? Yes. Yeah. Usually they'll depict it in like TV shows, right? And as soon as the cuffs come out, kind of thing. Sometimes before cuffs even come out, right? You're getting ready to stuff them in the back of the car. Miranda. That's not when we're required to get it. It's only whenever you have a custodial interrogation. So that's questioning when you're in custody, or you've been charged for more full than I thought, or you've been charged with a crime. At that point in time, you're informed of your rights there too. And so as long as you don't have these things or you're not charged, you don't have to do it at all, right? So it's not uncommon to see people who, in the course of a traffic stop or something like that, they end up getting arrested. If they're not Mirandized right away, they might think that there's a procedural error there and they're going to get away with something. Like not always. Right? Sometimes there's not going to be any questions. Just get in there. That kind of thing. And so that's one of those. What would you say? Errored thoughts that's kind of out there. So like whenever you tell a police officer or you ask the police officer, they have to tell you. It's like no. Why would they do that? Of course they can lie. Yeah. And so this is going to talk about totality of circumstances. We've already talked about that. But that in custody aspect of it is probably the most important facet of this part. Because you know what happens when you're questioned, right? Anytime that there's anything coming up that's likely to get away information that could incriminate you, that's questioning, right? So it doesn't have to be specific words, but that situation. Let's see here, learning objectives. Okay, so we've already talked about confessions. That's different than an incriminating statement. Incriminating statements are everything, right? That could be anything from my favorite ones is to identify like you were at X place at Y time, right? That might have no bearing on anything at all, or that might put you real close to where this thing took place, right? If that puts you close, right there off the bat, just something as bland as mediocre as, yeah, I was over at such and such at this time. Okay, now you're a suspect. Like, ooh, that kind of thing, and you can build guilt from that very, very quickly. It says here, even silence can constitute an incriminating statement. Didn't answer that question. I think I need to tell you about that. I don't think so. Boom. Yeah, so this is confessions. You mentioned seeing the corpus bill like that. That's if you have someone who just comes in and gives you a confession kind of thing. That we have to go and verify that the crime actually took place. Right? Originated angling. Solely protect defendants' possibility of fabricated testimony. Yeah, because torture and interrogation practices at the time. Yeah. Okay. Some have modified that to trustworthiness doctrine under its corroborating this must establish trustworthiness of the confession. Right. So we have a thing where we want to pull information out of people to get them to confess. We also have the opposite problem. Sometimes people confess the stuff that they didn't do. Right. Sometimes we want them to confess the stuff they didn't do. Sometimes we don't. Ideally, we should never want them to confess something they didn't do. Yeah. Of course, adopt the rule. Some independent evidence of a criminal act to establish it. Boom. So, without that corroborating evidence, there is no crime. Ooh, what is the film I'm thinking of? You guys ever seen the movie American Psycho? It's an old arrest. Good, you got it too. Excellent. I just now noticed those words coming back. American Psycho. The reason why that popped up in my head is the very ending of it leaves you in a place where you don't know what anything you saw was actually real. If it's all made up. Christian Bale movie. Oh, like graphic film, violent.
That man was going around killing people.
Yeah, yeah. 80s, yuppie looking guy. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But at the very end, what happens is he calls and starts confessing to stuff, and no one has any proof anymore. So it's like nothing happened. So you don't know if he's crazy or if it's just mistakes, and no one is even going to look at it because he's a yuppie. And so it's a really weird movie, but that's the kind of situation. It's like if you call and confess, there's no corroborating evidence. There's nothing there. You just said a whole bunch of weird stuff. All right, making sense of this can be difficult to obtain independent corroborating evidence of sexual assaults in children. Yeah, so that's some of the dark topics. Yeah, so in those cases, they've abandoned that rule. Okay. So there's that voluntariness, and is there anything I need really going with that? Probably not. I'm going to move pretty fast to this because we talked about a lot of it already. Okay. So yeah, that's just the voluntariness. It's per se unconstitutional. So if they're overbearing the will of the accused, meaning if they're forcing it out of you, to give you an idea of that, that's Brown versus Mississippi. That's the case where forced confession 1 day turnaround, I think, in terms of trial. And when they were at trial, because it was more than one person there, all it doesn't give you the numbers there. I'm trying to remember how many there were there. Black youths. When they showed up at court, they still had burn marks on their neck from where they'd been forcibly hung. They were strangling them. They're hanging to death. Yeah, you're going to confess. We're going to hang you to death. All right, I'll confess then. Right? I get in there. I got burn marks on my neck. They're strangling me to death. That's a false confession. I don't care. You're convicted. That's what happened there. I had to go all the way to Supreme Court to fix that. That's a different error, right? Yeah. In a strongly worded decision, held confessions used as evidence were involuntarily obtained. Yeah. Yeah. It was interesting because that one, if I remember correctly, they were actually given counsel for that one, but it was all of 1 day's worth of counsel too. And so it's like, here's your counsel, here's your beating, your confession, and here's your death sentence. I was like, good God. Yeah, use of violence or force, inadmissible. Even coercive tactics there. Here's where it moves in totality of circumstances. So you start looking at the whole picture. Vulnerabilities, what types of it's like qualitative aspects of the interrogation. You can look at place of where you're at. Of course, what all has gone on is that last one there, because there's a lot in that one. Give you an idea for location and just how the place of questioning and that kind of stuff can have a factor. Okay. If I show up at your house and pick you in, you're going to have one reaction, right? That's going to be a more serious reaction than just show up in your house and start asking questions. Okay. If I show up in your house at 3:30 in the morning and take you in, that's a different response you'll get, right? First one wasn't good. That second one's even worse, right? And so stuff like that. You can find cases where it's factors like that can have a huge bearing. That place of questioning is the biggest, because that's where you get the functional equivalent of an interrogation. And we'll talk about that in a second, because this will move into that term here in a second. It's moving through all these other ones. Deception, lies, use promotive confession do not automatically make it involuntary. Yes, you can lie. Promises, yeah, that's involuntary because you're making promises. Yeah, that one right there. Threats to arrest family members, remove children from custody, all those things. Okay. Leniency is generally treated as a confession being involuntary. So if we're going to give you something, that's involuntary. That one's not, though. Ew. It's dirty. Right? You're going to threaten to remove someone's kids, just get them confessed? That's okay? I don't know. That's a hard one. Age and experience. Yeah, if you're dealing with juveniles, age and experience. Depending on that, request to talk to your parents. Not necessarily making it inadmissible either. In fact, that one I was mentioning about 3 in the morning, that's actually a case where it was like a 16 or 17-year-old. They showed up at his house, parents let him in. They took him in that morning at 3 a.m. When they were picking him up, that's whenever actually he made a statement, I think in his own bedroom. So it's like, that's not how you do that. Here's where it gets to Miranda. Told her your right to remain silent. Anything you say will be used against you, lawyer, and then that indigency line. If you can't afford one will be appointed to you. Right? So Miranda itself is you're not supposed to, what does it say? May not question suspect without first informing them the right to remain silent. That's not quite accurate. Right? Because it has to be whenever you're charged or you have that custodial interrogation. Right? That's whenever it kicks in. Whenever there's a situation that's likely to elicit, must be in custody or the functional equivalent of formal arrest, and they must be questioned, seeking to interrogate the suspect about suspected criminal conduct. When you talk about the functional equivalent of a custodial interrogation, or functional equivalent of arrest, it's like that doesn't have to be an arrest itself, right? That situation where you show up at someone's room at 3 a.m. and you take them somewhere else other than the police station, stuff like that happens, right? It's like that's not the same thing. Is that an interrogation? Yes, it is. That's an interrogation. They're transporting you somewhere. Yeah, that's a big one, right? That's why they always Mirandize you before transporting you. You're in a confined space with someone. There's likely to be some conversation. If something comes out, they want it to be useful. It's not that the person's necessarily trying to pull it out of them. So you can find situations where that has been the case, where it's they're literally trying to force it out. When you get into that rule, basically that's it'll give you a citation probably in this one in a couple seconds. But basically what it is if you're involving the person in the conversation, that's an interrogation. If it's something that's happening in their presence and they volunteer something of their own, that's not interrogation. So basically what happens there, if it gets into that, there'll be a couple of cases we'll talk about in a police car. If it's a police officer and the suspect engaging in conversation, yeah, you're interrogating that person if it brings forward anything incriminating. If it's two officers in the front having a conversation, and that person in the back starts speaking up, that's voluntary. And so that's the way that they were able to work that. In custody, objective basis, totality of circumstances, that being that you're not free to leave and the presence of questioning. So you have custody and questions, you're being interrogated, right? So that can happen on scene, that can happen in the car, that can happen anywhere along the way, right? And it's that reasonable standard of not being able to leave. Okay. There's the waiver. You gave it, yeah. Then you asked them if they understood it, and if you still want to speak. Okay. Invocation. This is the fun. You have a right to remain silent. Is silence invoking it? No. Yeah. If you are just silent, questions will just continue. Right? There's no need to stop questioning. We talked about standing mute. If you're going to plead for your innocence or guilt, if you stand mute, you're innocent, right? They'll go forward with the trial. So it's like in this situation, if you're not saying it, you're not saying anything at all. We'll keep questioning you. And phrases here are not direct enough to be picked up as requests for lawyers. Maybe I should speak to a lawyer. I think I want to, or something of that nature. It's like that's shaky enough that they don't have to. I want my lawyer. I want to talk to a lawyer right now. That'll get you a lawyer, right? Of course, you can find cases where that didn't take place, where it's didn't ask for a lawyer, they didn't get it. They have to go through and reinforce that. Also note the difference between a Fifth Amendment invocation and a Sixth. Fifth one is you refuse to answer a single question. Sixth Amendment changes procedure, bigger effect, right? I want a lawyer means they stop asking you questions, they provide you with a lawyer, and the lawyers are going to be there for future questioning, right? So questioning stops, meetings, reconvene later. This is just next question, please, if you invoke Fifth Amendment. And if you reapproach them after invoking it, that's a waiver. I've invoked my right to a lawyer, but I'm going to go up and talk to this officer. Yeah, I just waive my rights by doing that. Okay. Yeah. Suspect must unequivocally invoke those rights. Otherwise, any questions afterwards, not going to be considered coercion. Break in custody. So that's 14 days. So I think I talked about that when we were talking about the exclusionary rule. The same thing applies here. So you invoke your Miranda. You have to have that break in custody 14 days before you approach somebody, right? Came up with the exclusionary rule as well. That's also going to be Wong Sun versus United States. Same kind of situation. You have that break in custody. It clears things out. You can re-invoke your rights, though, again. If you're still in custody, there is no 14-day window. So if you're sitting in prison or jail awaiting trial, right, you invoke your rights, you're going to be there for a couple months. During that entire time frame, they can't approach you, put you into interrogation. They have to set that up with your lawyer, kind of thing between you and the lawyer. Okay, when they're not required, you're not in custody. Volunteer information, spontaneous declaration, talk about those. On the scene questioning, like that's before usually you made any decisions for arrest anyway or charging. That's just literally questioning. You don't have any form of accusation necessarily there. We move to accusations, technically move to that charging stage. And then standard investigations, standard stops in terms of like stop and frisk, traffic stops. They're basically the same thing as a terrorist stop, right? So you won't have that same formality. Okay. Routine booking questions, private persons, border agents dealing with people trying to get in the country. That one, that last one, you're still under the controlled criminal justice system. That's not done. You've been sentenced to some type of treatment or other types of programs, probation, parole, those types of things. Your rights are massively reduced. Okay. So this is just kind of reinforcing that if you've invoked your Miranda rights, attempts from the police to initiate interrogation is presumed to be involuntary, right? Public safety is an exception. Yeah, that's normal. Yeah, that's the kind of thing. Next one, resting your firearm. Okay, so that's where they identify that. Look, officers question defendant about the location of gun without Miranda warnings, right? So basically what happened with that one was direct asking because of the nature of the danger associated with it. Gun could have stayed there where children could have found it. And questions were aimed at locating gun, public danger, did not limit the reasonableness of their actions. So you could use it. Next one, Miranda, prior to search warrant, police asked if they had anything dangerous was in the house. He answered a bomb was inside. They shut down the search and used a robot to find the bomb. Court rejected the defendant's claim the public safety exception was inapplicable because the police had secured the area. So you had a person who's causing trouble, right? What do you have? I don't know, bomb, right? What happens? Okay, let's treat it like there's an actual bomb. This might be a crazy person, right? Do you get to say that that's not a public safety issue? No, that's not the defendant their challenge. But that's not a public safety issue. Yes, it is. Okay. Yeah, that's not as good as some of the other ones. Anyhow. When should you be able to mention defendant's silence before the jury? That's where you get into one of those big questions, right? I think early in the semester I mentioned Rittenhouse because they did this in that case, and that was televised, right? You made allusions to the right to remain silent. You were going to use that against someone. No, you can't use that silence against someone. When it's used, depends on this. When it occurred, sounds used as a case in chief or to impeach the trial of the testimony of the defendant, right? Okay. Silence in the face of questions asked before or after Miranda cannot be used unless you're moving to that impeachment stage where I talked about that. Okay. From there, threats to loss of job or license. Okay, so covered, not intern in custody, covered in custody, covered Now we'll be moving into threats from other sources. Okay. State required licensing. For example, mentions here investigators, that kind of stuff. The response to a complaint be submitted. If such a response, if given, could implicate the person in criminal proceeding. That investigators cannot threaten the person being investigated with job loss or license if that person refuses to answer based on the Fifth Amendment. Right. So if you're hiring someone, is it almost time? Ooh, it is almost time. Ooh, what's this? Cool. Very cool. Ah. So if you're hiring someone, that's the same kind of pressure, right? It's no different. But with that, I think we can call it a day. We'll pick up with this one last time. We're about halfway through. We will wrap this up next time, study for the next exam, and then pick up there. Catch you Wednesday.
Every criminal justice major that's declared gets one of these shirts.
Look at that. There's the back. Declared major. There's the front.
They need to get a hold of Thessalonia Tallow or
Okay.
Sarah Sanchez
Cool.
up in the GA office.
All right. That's here in Wilson the
And
third.
once they get their shirt, then they will scratch their name off the list for criminal justice.
Excellent. All righty. Well,
What size? Large. Grab that one and I'll have her
yeah. Yeah, that one.
knock you off the list.
All right.
Appreciate that.
I'll see if you guys have been here in person. You got a free shirt. Take care. Catch y'all later. Bye.